It's strange how quickly the Amazon rainforest can turn from a place of wonder to something that feels like it wants you gone. I'd gone down there for work, part of a research project mapping deforestation patterns. It was 2019 and I was 31. I wasn't some inexperienced tourist. I had worked in forests before, mostly in the US, and I thought I knew what to expect. But the Amazon isn't like anywhere else. It swallows you whole in ways you can't even explain. Our team had set up a small research station about 20 meters from the nearest village. Calling it a cabin was generous. It was more like a large wooden shack. It had 4 walls, a roof, and just enough space for a couple of cots, a desk, and our equipment. At first, it seemed perfect. The thick canopy above kept the worst of the heat off, and the hum of the jungle felt almost calming. I even enjoyed the rainstorms that rolled in every afternoon. But then one night, everything changed. It started with rain, of course. In the Amazon, rain isn't a gentle patter. It's like the sky opens up and dumps the ocean on your head. That night was worse than usual. By sunset, the rain was pounding so hard on the roof it felt like the wood might cave in. The sound was deafening, drowning out even the constant buzz of insects and the calls of distant animals. I was alone in the cabin that night. One of my colleagues had taken the boat downriver to get supplies, and the others were staying in the village for a few days. I didn't mind. I'd always liked solitude. But as the rain kept hammering down, I started to feel uneasy. The thing about being deep in the rainforest is how isolating it feels. No cell service, no roads, no one around for miles, just the endless trees and the knowledge that if something went wrong, you'd be on your own. I'd always thought I was okay with that. But that night, with the storm raging outside, the isolation started to feel more like a trap. Around midnight, I noticed something odd. The rain was still hammering down, but the usual jungle noises had stopped. No frogs, no crickets, nothing. Just silence. At first, I thought maybe the storm had scared them off. But then I remembered that wasn't how it worked. Rain didn't silence the jungle. It usually made it louder. I turned off the lamp and sat still, listening. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling outside. It wasn't the wind, it was deliberate, like something moving slowly through the underbrush. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a tapir or an armadillo, but it didn't feel right. The sound was too steady, too deliberate. Grabbing my flashlight, I walked to the window and shone it out into the trees. The beam of light barely penetrated the rain, but I could see the immediate area around the cabin. Nothing. Just wet leaves and muddy ground. I told myself I was being paranoid and went back to the cot, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a loud thud. My heart was racing before I even opened my eyes. The sound had come from the back of the cabin. Sitting up, I grabbed the flashlight and aimed it toward the noise. The door was still shut, but something heavy had hit the wall. The thud came again, followed by another. It wasn't random, it was rhythmic, like something was testing the strength of the cabin. I felt a cold sweat break out on my back. I wasn't armed apart from a small utility knife. My radio was useless in the storm. Forcing myself to move, I crept toward the back wall, trying to stay silent. I pressed my ear to the wood and listened. For a moment, there was nothing but the rain. Then I heard it, a low, wet sound like something breathing heavily. It wasn't an animal I recognized. It wasn't an animal at all. The thudding stopped and everything went silent again. I stood there frozen for what felt like hours. Finally, I decided to check outside. I told myself it was just a precaution, but the truth was I needed to know if whatever was out there was gone. I stepped outside into the rain, holding the flashlight in one hand and the knife in the other. The rain was so heavy I could barely see a few feet ahead, but I swept the beam across the area around the cabin. At first, it seemed normal, just mud and water pooling around the base of the trees. But then I saw them, footprints. They were large, barefoot, and deep, like someone heavy had been walking in the mud. The tracks led from the back of the cabin into the trees. My stomach dropped. Whoever, or whatever, had made those tracks wasn't an animal. They were human, or close enough. I followed the tracks to the edge of the clearing, but they disappeared into the underbrush. The thought of going any further made my skin crawl. I backed away and returned to the cabin. locking the door behind me. For the rest of the night, I sat in the corner with the knife in my hand, listening to the rain and waiting for dawn. When the sun finally came up, the rain had stopped, and the jungle was alive again. Birds were calling, insects buzzing, everything back to normal. It almost felt like the night before had been a bad dream. But the footprints were still there, half filled with water but unmistakable. I spent the day checking the area, but I found nothing else. No more tracks. No signs of who or what had been there. When my colleague returned later that afternoon, I didn't tell him what had happened. I didn't know how to explain it without sounding crazy. I stayed in the Amazon for another month, but I never felt safe after that night. Every time it rained, I found myself tensing up, listening for that thud on the wall. Nothing ever happened again, but the memory stayed with me. I've thought about it a lot since then, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just some local hunter passing through, curious about the cabin. Maybe it was something else entirely. I don't know. All I know is that the Amazon is a place that doesn't care about you. It doesn't want you there. And sometimes it lets you know. My partner and I are avid hikers. Last July, we went on a trip and decided to camp at a spot we love just west of Shenandoah. It's quiet, off the beaten path, and offers absolutely spectacular views of both Shenandoah and portions of George Washington National Forest to the west. The first day and evening of this trip were nice and uneventful, though we didn't sleep very well because of the humidity. The next morning, we decided to go for a hike in a portion of Jefferson Forest we'd never been to before. It's comprised of ATV trails and about a dozen campsites, but has a trail that leads to an old fire tower we'd always wanted to check out. It was about a 45-minute drive from our campsite, mostly on back roads. When we got there, the first thing that stood out to us was how empty the campsites were. We actually didn't camp there the night before because we'd heard that the site is usually packed, and we knew we wouldn't arrive early enough in the weekend to get a spot. There were only 2 spots taken. One had a desiccated tent and a bunch of garbage, looking like someone had been there for a while but had abandoned it. The other had a young woman, I'm guessing in her late teens, setting up a small backpacking tent. There was a truck and one other smaller car in the parking area. We parked and started getting our gear together. The woman approached us to ask if we knew where the trailhead was. I told her that we'd read it branched off about 100 yards into one of the ATV tracks, but we weren't 100% sure which one. Since I was getting such a weird vibe from this place, I kind of hoped she'd stick around and go with us to find it. But she just thanked us and took off in the general direction of the trail. We set off and walked down a few ATV trails until we found the actual walking path. We saw 2 ATVs shoot by us at one point, but otherwise didn't encounter anyone else, including the woman from earlier. It took us about an hour to get to the top of the mountain where the fire tower was. It's an old metal structure, and you have to climb a narrow set of stairs to get to the top. We got up, looked around, took some pictures, and then headed back down. Honestly, the view was kind of a letdown. About halfway down, very suddenly, everything stopped. The birds, the bugs, it was dead silent. I don't know quite how to put this into words, but it felt like the ancientness of the forest was contorting and crushing us. We felt trapped and cornered despite the expanse around us. My partner and I looked at one another and wordlessly started to book it out of there. We started running back to the car, but the feeling followed us. As we were rounding one of the switchbacks, we heard this unearthly shriek, like a cross between metal on metal and a choir screaming off-key. We saw something, just got a glimpse of it, right before we blacked out. I don't know how to describe it other than it looked huge, despite clearly not taking up much physical space. It moved in writhes and flashes, didn't have a color, and just felt like evil and emptiness. I probably only perceived it for about half a second before my memory gave way. When we came to, we were sitting in the car. 2 hours had passed, double the length of time it took us to get up there. I don't know if we lost consciousness or somehow blocked those hours out. I learned later the same thing had happened to my partner. Both of the cars were still next to us in the parking lot, and there were still just 2 tents at the campsite. The woman wasn't in hers, and it looked exactly the same as she left it. I think about her all the time. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out if someone went missing around the time of our trip. It took a few months for my partner and me to talk about that day. Some of the stories I've seen posted on this sub have made me feel so much less alone. We still love to hike, but honestly, haven't been able to go back into the Appalachian forest since this happened. I'm curious if others have had similar experiences. We all make dumb decisions in life, but in this case, I was stupid. Very stupid. I arranged to meet a guy off Tinder, but because of my heightened anxiety about driving, I stupidly agreed for him to pick me up outside my house. I'd been talking to him for a few weeks at least, but that's still not excusable. I know the choice I made that day could have ended me, but thankfully, I'm still around to tell this tale. The guy picked me up in his car and told me he planned to take us out for sushi. I love sushi, so I thought, great. He put the name of the restaurant into his GPS, and we were off, making pleasant conversation along the way. Then I started noticing woods outside my window. I felt very confused. We were supposed to be going into town, not deep into the wilderness and into the middle of nowhere. Fear hit me hard. Then he said, I swear the GPS is taking me through here. I didn't choose this path. Please just get us back to civilization, I said, my eyes wide. I must have looked like a deer in headlights. His face looked completely apprehensive, so he must have known I was scared completely out of my mind. I thought to myself, I should have just conquered my anxiety about driving and met him somewhere in public. Or better yet, not met this guy at all. What was I thinking? I'm gonna get murdered out here in these woods. I tried checking my phone to see if I could assist him with the GPS, and that's when he said those spine-chilling words to me. There's no signal out here. I remember thinking to myself, just look calm. Don't let him think you suspect he's up to something. But man, I was terrified. The tips of my fingers were cold, and I was simultaneously sweating. If he was going to kill me, part of me wanted him to just get it over with, so I wouldn't have to endure the anticipation. His forehead was sweating, and he kept saying, I swear I'm not doing this. I'm trying to get us back en route to the sushi place. I responded, I don't care about sushi anymore. Just get us to a gas station, anywhere with people at this point. Then he said, I don't have a shovel or a weapon in my trunk or anything, if that's what you're thinking, which obviously did little to calm my nerves. We finally reached the restaurant after what felt like an eternity. I had never been so scared in my life. I didn't have much of an appetite and was physically trembling when we arrived, but I figured he didn't kill me when he had the chance, so I guess it's safe now to continue the date. I had already planned to take an Uber home because I didn't want to go through that experience again. I was shocked out of my mind when he then asked, So, when do you think we'll have sex? I nearly choked on the piece of sashimi. What? I had no idea where this was coming from. I didn't know how he could even ask me something like that on a first date, especially after just seeing me pale as a ghost moments ago. You know, like, how long will you make me wait for it? A day? A week? A month? I stared at him, dumbfounded. I couldn't even find a response because I was utterly speechless in that moment. Well, I can't wait a whole month. I'm just telling you that right now. I didn't say anything and the rest of the date was insanely awkward. I said goodbye as I took my Uber home. Only seconds after my driver pulled out of the restaurant parking lot, my date texted me to say he didn't think it would work out because he needed a girl with a higher libido. I didn't even argue, just texted back a simple okay, completely ready to be done with this man. When the Uber driver took me home, he didn't drive through the wilderness or that potential murder site. Instead, he took me home through streets with cars and lights. The sweetest scene, to my immense relief. I couldn't help but wonder why my date had taken me on an hour-long drive through the wilderness just to get to the restaurant when it only took the Uber driver 15 minutes to get me home from the same location. This entire experience was chilling. I don't know if my date had planned something sinister or if it was just an honest mistake. Either way, I'm glad I made it out alive. I definitely learned a tough lesson that night. One I should have already known but foolishly ignored for some reason. Don't let strangers from a dating app pick you up in their car. And to the guy who took me through the woods, let's never meet again. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to rent a cabin deep in the Appalachian woods. I had just turned 32, and life in the city had worn me down. The constant noise, endless deadlines, and suffocating crowds made me crave solitude. I wanted silence, a break from everything. So I found a cabin online that promised complete isolation, surrounded by nothing but trees and mountains. It seemed perfect. The cabin was in Tennessee, far from the nearest town. The website described it as rustic, which I took to mean no Wi-Fi and maybe a wood-burning stove. That was fine with me. I wasn't looking for luxury. I wanted peace. I packed lightly: clothes, some food, a flashlight, a book, and my hunting knife. I wasn't planning to hunt, but I figured it was a good idea to have it, just in case. I arrived in the late afternoon after driving for nearly 6 hours. The last stretch of the journey was along a narrow dirt road that twisted and turned through the forest. My small sedan struggled with the uneven terrain, and I couldn't help but think I should have rented an SUV. Still, I made it. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering trees. The roof was mossy, the wood was weathered, and the windows looked a little warped, but it had a certain charm. There was no driveway, just a patch of dirt where I parked. The air smelled of pine and earth, and the only sounds were birds chirping and the distant rustle of leaves. It was exactly what I had hoped for. Inside, the cabin was simple: a single room with a bed, a small table, and a fireplace. There was a tiny kitchenette with a sink and an old propane stove. The bathroom was an outhouse a few yards behind the cabin. No electricity, no running water. It was primitive, but it felt right. I unloaded my things, lit a couple of oil lamps, and settled in. That first night, I sat by the fireplace, reading by the flickering light. The silence was almost overwhelming, but I welcomed it. I fell asleep easily, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket. I didn't even notice the creaking sounds that came from the woods as the wind moved through the trees. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. I had no phone signal, so I couldn't rely on GPS, but I had brought a map. The trails weren't well marked, but I figured I'd stick close to the cabin. I walked for hours, taking in the scenery. The forest was dense, with sunlight barely breaking through the canopy. I saw deer tracks, heard the distant call of a hawk, and even spotted a fox darting through the underbrush. By the time I returned, the sun was dipping low. I realized I had wandered farther than I intended, and made a mental note to be more careful. As I approached the cabin, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was a strange tension in the air. I brushed it off, chalking it up to my tired mind, and went inside. That night, I woke up suddenly. It was pitch black, and for a moment I couldn't figure out what had startled me. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like leaves being disturbed. It was coming from outside, near the edge of the clearing. My first thought was animals, maybe raccoons or a deer. But the sound didn't move like an animal. It was too slow, too deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and my knife, telling myself it was nothing. I opened the cabin door and shined the light toward the trees. The beam didn't reach far, but I saw nothing unusual. Still, the rustling continued, now seeming to circle the clearing. My heart pounded, and I closed the door, bolting it shut. The noise stopped after a while, and I eventually fell back asleep. In the morning, I found something that made my stomach twist. There were footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. Human footprints. They weren't mine. I hadn't been outside barefoot. The prints circled the cabin, stopping occasionally as if whoever made them had been standing and watching. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone else was camping nearby and had gotten lost. Maybe they were curious about the cabin. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. The cabin was miles from anything. I shook it off and decided to go about my day. I spent most of it chopping wood for the fireplace, trying to keep myself busy. That night, the noises came back. This time, it was more than rustling. I heard twigs snapping and what sounded like quiet footsteps. I stayed inside, clutching my knife and flashlight, too afraid to open the door. The sounds continued for hours, stopping and starting, always just beyond the edge of the clearing. In the morning, I found more footprints. They were closer to the cabin now, and there were more of them. I felt a knot of fear in my stomach. I decided to leave. I packed my things and loaded them into the car, but when I tried to start it, the engine wouldn't turn over. I checked under the hood and found nothing wrong. The car was old, but it had never given me trouble before. It didn't make sense. With no way to leave, I was stuck. I spent the day trying to figure out what to do. There was no phone signal, and the nearest town was too far to walk before dark. I decided to wait until morning and hike to the main road, hoping to flag down a passing car. That night, the noises were worse. They started earlier, just as the sun was setting. I heard heavy breathing outside the cabin, and at one point, something scratched at the door. I stayed up all night, sitting by the fireplace with my knife in hand. When dawn finally came, I felt a mix of relief and dread. I grabbed my backpack and started walking toward the main road. The forest felt different, darker, quieter. Every snap of a twig made me jump. After an hour, I realized I was lost. The trail I thought I was following had disappeared, and the trees all looked the same. I stopped to get my bearings, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing in the distance between the trees. They were too far away to make out any details, but I could tell they were watching me. I froze, my heart racing. Then they moved, disappearing into the shadows. I turned and ran, not caring which direction I went, as long as it was away from them. I ran until my legs burned and my lungs felt like they would burst. Eventually, I stumbled back into the clearing where the cabin sat. I had somehow gone in a circle. Desperate and out of options, I locked myself inside the cabin. I stayed there for 2 more days, surviving on the food I had left. The noises never stopped. Sometimes I heard footsteps, other times whispers. I never saw who or what it was, but I knew they were out there, waiting. On the 3rd day, I woke up to silence. No rustling, no footsteps, just the wind in the trees. I cautiously stepped outside, clutching my knife. My car was gone. The patch of dirt where it had been parked was empty, with no tire tracks leading away, just empty space. I didn't wait to find out what would happen next. I grabbed my backpack and started walking, not caring about the direction. Eventually, I stumbled onto the main road and flagged down a passing truck. The driver took one look at me and didn't ask any questions. I never went back to the cabin, and I never found out who or what had been out there. All I know is that something was watching me, and it wanted me gone. It was early spring 2017. I had just turned 25 years old. My friend and I had reached our main camping spot, Black Canyon Rim Campgrounds, just outside of Payson, Arizona. We usually traveled out here 2 or 3 times a year. It had some incredible views and was only a couple of hours away from the city. For the most part, this area was pretty secluded. A privately owned convenience store was a few miles away, with a small town about 20 miles before that. The entrance to the campground was on a dirt road directly off the highway, marked with a sign displaying information about local wildlife, fire hazards, and general camping news. The path was mostly linear, with one fork spanning several miles. We once followed the dirt road to see how far it would take us. One path led to another highway entrance with a ranger's tower halfway there. The other led to a dead end with an abandoned cabin hidden a few miles in, concealed by large foliage. The snow had mostly cleared up by this time of year, leaving behind crisp air and a slight chill. The fauna was becoming active again. We'd usually spot wild horses, deer, and plenty of smaller critters whenever we came out this way. It was the perfect time of year for a relaxing trip to get away from the city for a few days. We arrived around 4 p.m. on a Tuesday, late for us, as we usually tried to get there by noon at the latest. This trip was pretty spontaneous. We both had work over the coming weekend and decided to just go for it. The sun was setting fast, and we still hadn't picked a campsite. There were maybe 2 other groups, both families, parked somewhat close to the entrance, only a few hundred yards from the highway. This time around, we wanted to get away from people for a while. Customer service jobs will do that to you. We drove further down the dirt road, past our usual spot, and finally picked the perfect area, a small clearing on the edge of a hill with a stunning view of the valley below and the sunset. We decided this would be our main spot from then on, if the next night's incident hadn't happened, that is. We agreed to get a campfire going and decided not to set up a tent. We didn't have much time, and her car wasn't that uncomfortable. I'd sleep in the back seat, and she'd take the passenger seat. With the windows slightly ajar, a few blankets each, and the serene sounds of nature, we thought we'd drift into a restful slumber. The next day went by uneventfully as we decompressed. However, I had a strange feeling throughout the day, as if we were being watched. Every few hours, I'd hear the crunching of leaves just out of sight. I brushed it off as local wildlife, though my friend didn't notice anything unusual. When night came, the feeling still lingered. My friend must have sensed it too, though she didn't vocalize it. She ended up taking some sleeping pills, something she rarely needed on these trips, as the ambience of nature was usually enough to lull her to sleep. Around 1 a.m., my friend had dozed off in the passenger seat, while I was in the back seat, scrolling through my phone. The window opposite me was rolled down slightly, letting in the cold breeze. Suddenly, I heard something outside, leaves crunching nearby. I whispered to my friend, "Hey, do you hear that?" But she was already asleep. I put my phone down and listened intently for a couple of minutes. Nothing. Probably just a small animal. I returned to my phone, but 10 minutes later, I heard it again, this time closer, right outside the car door. I lowered my phone, my eyes adjusting from its glow to the darkness. As I turned the phone away, its backlight illuminated the window near my feet. What I saw still haunts me. Two dirty, scabbed hands gripping the window frame, the long, dark nails curling inside the car. Behind the window was the silhouette of a face pressed against the glass. Every few seconds, its breath created condensation. All I could make out were the reflections of its black, empty eyes. I froze. I couldn't move or scream. It felt like an eternity as I locked eyes with this thing. Thoughts raced through my head. Why hasn't it run away? What is it planning? Is this the face of death? After about 10 seconds, the hand slowly unclenched, retreating into the darkness. The condensation on the window began to fade. A moment later, I heard the crunching of leaves again, this time growing fainter as it moved away. I finally snapped out of my paralysis, pounding on my friend's seat to wake her. She stirred, confused. I kicked open the back door and scanned the area, but whatever it was had vanished. I frantically gathered our camping supplies, shoving everything into the car while constantly glancing over my shoulder. When I slammed the back door shut, I saw them, a grim reminder of what had just happened. 2 handprints on the window. In a panic, I wiped them away as if erasing the event itself. I jumped into the driver's seat, started the car, and floored it out of there. My friend, now fully awake, asked what was going on. I could barely explain as I sped down the dirt road. Eventually, we reached the highway, and 20 miles later, we stopped at a Denny's. There, I recounted everything that had happened. Months later, the nightmare subsided, but the embarrassment lingered. People say you either have a fight or flight instinct. I'm still unsure which I have, because I did neither. To this day, I often wonder, who or what was out there? A prankster? A resident of that abandoned cabin? Something paranormal? We've gone camping there since, but never stray far from the highway. Whatever it was, I hope it's the last I'll see of it. This happened back in 2004 in northern Wisconsin. I was 16 at the time, out deer hunting with my dad and one of his friends, Frank. I remember this day like it was yesterday, though the dialogue itself isn't word for word. The idea of it is 100% accurate. My dad and I had a few different stands over an area of maybe 3/4 of a square mile. He'd been hunting there for at least 10 years, and I'd been going with him since I was around 5. Up until I was about 12, I was just tagging along. On this particular morning, we walked to my stand first. It was about 5 a.m. and it was still dark outside. I got situated, and my dad and Frank went off to the other 2 stands over a ridge, maybe 500 to 600 yards away. Sitting there in the dark is always a little eerie. Not long after my dad and Frank left, I saw a flashlight in the general direction of where they had headed, maybe 200 yards away, roughly moving in my direction. I figured they had forgotten something from the truck, so I radioed to see what they were doing. My dad said they weren't backtracking, so obviously this flashlight belonged to someone else. This isn't super common, but it's not a huge deal either. Those woods get crowded sometimes, and there's a parking spot in that general direction. I turned on my light so the other hunter could see that someone was already there. The person stopped, and then I saw the light turn and head in a different direction. No big deal. I ended up dozing off while it was still dark out. When I woke up, the sun was up, and it was around 8 a.m. I sat there for a bit and radioed my dad to see if he'd seen or heard anything moving. Nothing yet. A couple of gunshots went off in the distance. I got up to take a slow walk to get my blood moving a bit. Not far, maybe 30 yards out and back, trying not to make any noise. When I returned to my stand, I sat down and took a good look around. Nothing was really going on. Then, I looked out to my left where I'd seen that flashlight earlier and I spotted something orange. For those unfamiliar, hunters have to wear blaze orange during gun season. I radioed my dad and Frank to see if either of them was moving around. Dad again said no, and I got no response from Frank. I grabbed the binoculars out of my backpack to see if it might be Frank, but it definitely wasn't. This guy was looking at me through his scope, his rifle aimed directly at me. This is obviously a huge no-no, a massive rule we all learn in hunter's education. Never point your rifle at something you don't intend to shoot. Still, dumb people do it. It's rare but not unheard of, and it's why responsible hunters use binoculars. My first thought was, what is this guy doing? Even with me looking at him, he didn't lower his gun. Now I was starting to panic, thinking I might become the next hunting murder victim. I slowly grabbed my rifle, got up, and stayed behind as many trees as I could while walking down a little path to the side of my stand. My stand was on a small knoll on the side of a much larger hill. I radioed my dad and told him what was going on. He told me to sit tight and stay out of sight. Obviously, as a 16-year-old, I couldn't do that and kept looking. Every time I looked, that guy was still aiming in my direction, but always standing in a different spot. I'd look, hide, then look again, and he'd be 30 yards from where he was the last time. About 10 minutes of this went by. My dad radioed me. Looking back, he was trying to keep me calm. At the time, though, I thought he wasn't taking me seriously. I told him, he's still there, but he keeps moving. I don't know what his problem is. Dad told me to stay hidden, and that he'd be near the guy in a minute or two. That's when I heard the shot. I lost my mind trying to get a hold of my dad. Did he just get shot? Where is he? Did he have to shoot that guy? What's going on? I sat there for what felt like hours, though it was only 2 or 3 minutes. Finally, I heard my dad on the radio. All right, come on out and head toward my stand. I peeked over the knoll and saw my dad waving from along the ridge where the random guy had been. I made my way over to him to see what had happened. It turned out Frank had been feeling a little restless, took a stroll and ended up on the other side of the ridge where the stranger was, not even knowing he was there. Frank had knocked his radio battery loose while getting situated earlier that morning and had no idea anything was going on. The shot I'd heard was Frank shooting a deer. Dad said as soon as Frank shot, the guy walked off, heading toward the logging road. We helped Frank with his deer and decided to call it an early day. Although I was extremely nervous, the rest of the week passed without incident. So, to the dumbass stranger in the woods with absolutely no common sense, let's never ever meet again. I remember the camping trip with my grandmother like it happened yesterday. I always called her Gran. She loved the outdoors, always saying it kept her feeling young. I wasn't as excited as she was, but I thought it would be nice to spend some time with her. We drove out to a far-off spot in the woods, far from any towns or people. Gran liked it that way, quiet and peaceful. The first day was pretty normal. We set up our tent, cooked dinner over a fire, and watched the sun go down behind the trees. Gran talked about the different plants and animals around us. Her voice was calm and steady, and it made me feel safe, like nothing could go wrong as long as she was there. That night I fell asleep quickly, the sounds of the forest making me feel relaxed. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. The fire had burned down to just a few glowing bits of wood, and the night was completely dark. I could hear Gran breathing steadily from her side of the tent, so I knew she was still asleep. I tried to figure out what had woken me up. The night was still almost too quiet. I listened closely, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat, which was starting to race. I told myself it was nothing, just the unfamiliar place making me nervous. Nervous, I tried to go back to sleep, but then I heard it. Something moving outside the tent. It was faint, like a soft shuffling through the leaves. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some other harmless animal, but then the sound got louder, closer, like whatever it was moving around our campsite. I lay there frozen, not sure what to do. My eyes were wide open, staring into the dark, trying to see something that wasn't there. The noise stopped, and I felt a small bit of relief, thinking it had moved on. But then I heard it again, right outside the tent, just inches from where I was lying. The sound was different now, not like an animal, more like someone dragging their feet through the dirt. My mind raced with all kinds of thoughts, none of them good. I didn't want to wake Gran, thinking it might just be my imagination. But as the minutes passed, the sound didn't stop, it only got worse. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I sat up slowly, trying to be as quiet as possible. I reached for the flashlight by my side, my hands shaking. I didn't want to turn it on, scared of what I might see, but I had to know what was out there. Just as I was about to turn on the light, the dragging sound stopped again, followed by an eerie silence. I held my breath, listening, waiting for something to happen. The silence dragged on, and I started to think that maybe whatever it was had left. Maybe it was all in my head, just me being paranoid about being in the woods at night. I slowly relaxed my grip on the flashlight, easing up. That's when I felt something brush against the side of the tent, right where I was sitting. It was subtle, but it was definitely there, like a hand or a branch lightly touching the tent fabric. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would explode out of my chest. I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to calm down. I needed to stay clear-headed to think this through. I decided to wait it out to see if whatever was out there would leave. But the minutes felt like hours, and the silence was only broken by the occasional rustling, too close for comfort. Then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. No more dragging, no more rustling, just the sound of my own breathing and Gran's soft snores. I sat there for what felt like forever, waiting for the noise to come back, but it never did. Eventually, exhaustion caught up with me, and I must have fallen asleep. When I woke up, it was morning. Sunlight was shining through the trees, and everything looked so normal, so peaceful. It was hard to believe that the night before had even happened. Gran was already up, making breakfast over the fire. I didn't mention what I had heard, and she didn't say anything either. Maybe it was better that way. We packed up camp after breakfast, and I felt a strange relief as we drove away, leaving that place behind. But as we left the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there with us that night. Something that didn't belong. I kept glancing back, half expecting to see someone or something watching us from the trees. Even now, I can't explain what happened, but one thing is for sure. Something was out there, and it was watching us. I can't stop thinking about what could have happened if I had turned on that flashlight, if I had actually seen what was outside the tent. Part of me is glad I didn't, but another part of me feels like it's still out there, waiting. I won't be going back to those woods. Never. But sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet and dark, I can almost hear it again, the dragging sound just outside getting closer. This incident happened in 2019. I would love to know if anyone else has had a similar encounter, because I've never been able to shake the feeling that this individual is a serial predator of some kind. I've never been able to stop thinking about what happened. My then boyfriend and I were on a road trip during the winter of 2018. It took a day to visit Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona. For anyone who hasn't been there, you drive down a long road that winds through landscapes and exit at various stops along the way to view different points. We were there at maybe our second or third stop when we encountered the creep. This particular stop has a wide parking lot and a handful of large educational signs at either end, and a path that leads up to a historic site and various vantage points. As we made our way up the path to the main site, a man was coming down towards the parking lot. He looked pretty much exactly like Mr. Clean, but in a red t-shirt and jeans. He was tall, upwards of 6'2". As we passed each other, he muttered something odd under his breath, though it was clearly intended to get our attention. My boyfriend turned around and asked him what he said. The man looked at us almost stunned for a moment before he seemed to decide to come up with something else to say. He pointed into the distance and asked, no joke, "What's that over there?" All there was over there was some kind of utility box on the road through the park and desert. We brushed him off and said we didn't know, then continued up the path. When he called out, "See you later, pretty girl," there's hardly a woman alive who hasn't had something like this said to her 10,000 times before. But this felt unusually sinister and set my nerves on edge. We both decided to just ignore him though, and headed up to the rest of the site. After 15 to 20 minutes of looking around, I finally had to admit to my boyfriend that I felt like we were being watched. He nodded and said that guy hasn't left and has been watching us this entire time. From where we were standing on a hill, we could see the parking lot. I noticed our creep standing near an educational sign at the far edge of the parking lot, clearly positioned to see up the hill at us. We were both bugged by it, but we resolved not to let it ruin our time or to get too bent out of shape about it. We took our time at the stop, shook off the nerves, and by the time we went back to the parking lot, he was gone. We drove another mile or two to the next vantage point, which included a number of petroglyphs on a cliff wall that you can see using binoculars. You have to take a narrow road into the parking lot, which creates a bit of a bottleneck. As we were about to enter, a blue RAV4 pulled in front of us and blocked us from coming in. It was, in fact, that same creep. After a few moments of intense eye contact with my boyfriend, who would later say, without a trace of exaggeration, he felt like he wanted to kill him, the guy slowly pulled away and let us enter the lot. He left, so we told ourselves we were overthinking it, but I decided to spend a good long time where we were to let him get well ahead of us, so we wouldn't keep running into each other. Our next stop, a mile loop hike, was about 3.5 miles away. We figured we'd spent enough time at the petroglyphs that even if the guy was at our next destination, he'd either be close to done with the hike or leaving by then. Unfortunately, he waited for us about 2 miles up the road. We spotted that same blue RAV4 pulled over to the side of the road. The man was standing next to the car, sort of looking vaguely into the distance. The landscape is beautiful in the park, but even though there was nothing especially spectacular about this spot, maybe he was just taking it all in away from the crowds. As we drove by, I looked behind us, and he turned to watch us, staring at our car driving away until we rounded a corner and could no longer see him. When we got to the parking lot and got out to take the hike, we were both feeling a little rattled. My boyfriend, who normally tolerates creepiness in others to a fault, was so shaken by the vibes this guy gave off that he actually stashed a little window-breaking hammer from his car safety kit inside his hoodie pocket, just in case we felt we needed it for self-defense. I guess that sounds nuts now, but it's just one of those things we all do to feel a little safer when we get creeped out. The hike itself is down at the bottom of this kind of valley. You walk down a steep, winding path to the bottom, where the path splits and forms a circuit around this area that includes all these cool little hillocks of painted rock dotted with petrified wood. We made it all the way down to the beginning of the loop. We noticed the guy up at the top of the cliff off the parking lot, looking down our way. We were about halfway around the loop when we saw the guy at the base of the hill about to start. We were relieved because we knew we'd be out of there before him this time and felt like we could finally shake him and stop feeling weirded out. For most of the loop, you can see the whole path and the whole hill up to the parking lot. But for the middle section of the walk, you're shielded from view behind these little hillocks and different topography. When we emerged near the end of the loop, we were still feeling good, but took a quick look to place our creep before heading back. We didn't see him anywhere. Maybe he decided not to do the walk, or maybe he was behind one of those little hills. As we made our way back up the steep path, we noticed him at the top, just waiting by this informational sign. Switchback after switchback, he stayed put, apparently intently reading the sign. As we got closer, we noticed he was now holding something. When we got to the top of the path, where we knew we'd have to pass within inches of him again, we tightened up, locked arms, and prepared to march right past as quickly as we could. Even though lots of people were walking by him coming and going, he waited for us to cross his path. Turns out that what he now had in his hands was a windshield washing squeegee and a spray bottle. There was something in it. As we tried to walk past him, he turned to us and said, "Hey, can you help me? I'm running out of time," and started to hold up the spray bottle and squeegee. My boyfriend was in no mood and said, "Nope, leave us alone," in a pretty nice but harsh tone. As we kept walking, the guy, smiling, replied, "Well, you too. Nice ass, though. Both of you," and started determinedly following us. He was gaining on us by the time we got to the car, and I barely made it in and locked the door before he was right next to my window, staring at me. Even though I was freaked the hell out and my instinct was just to keep my head down, I didn't want to give him the upper hand and let him make me cower. So I looked up and stared right into his eyes. Just thinking about it makes my stomach turn. He was right up next to my window, staring and unblinking, with his hand up in a frozen wave, smiling. When I looked into his eyes, the first thought I had was that he wanted to skin me alive. It sounds completely insane to say, but I think anyone who's had an encounter with someone like this will completely relate. When someone means you harm, there's something that kicks in, and you feel it deep, in a strange way. My boyfriend had the presence of mind to start snapping pictures of the guy, who then moved around our car to try to keep us from driving away. My boyfriend started revving the engine to try to get him to move. It didn't work. He just kept blocking us. So we started inching the car forward. Still, he didn't move. We tapped him and he stumbled back a little, but just kept standing there. Then we noticed there was a family a couple of cars over staring at us over their lunch. The creep noticed too, smiled that nasty smile, and then just gave us enough room to get out of our parking spot. As we sped away, as we passed the family, the man in the front seat gave us an encouraging nod. It was sort of like, "We saw it, we're watching him, we've got your back." I immediately called the park office and told them what was going on. They sent a ranger out to check on the guy. We headed to Winslow, Arizona, stopped at a bar to have a drink, and tried to chill out. We were so freaked out that we actually checked the car for a tracking device, which also, I know, sounds crazy. But it was one of those situations where the vibe the guy was giving off turned the emotion of the events way past what seems normal. Later that night, we got a call from the ranger who told us they ended up having to arrest the guy for disorderly conduct and asked us to provide a statement of our experience. We tried to find more about him or what happened after we left, but haven't been successful. I'm so curious if this guy sounds familiar to anyone, especially the weird window washing ploy. In all our adrenaline, we had all kinds of wacky theories. Maybe there was some poison in the bottle, or the squeegee had a knife hidden in it or something. I'm sure we were exaggerating, but I've never been able to stop feeling like we dodged a bullet with that guy. This version corrects some spelling and grammar errors, making the story flow more smoothly. The air was cool when I got to the campsite, a remote spot deep in the woods. It had been years since I was last here with my ex-wife, and now it was just me. I set up the tent, started a fire, and tried to push away the awkward memories of her. Night fell quickly, and the forest grew dark. The fire crackled softly, casting the only light in the growing darkness. I was starting to relax when I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was hard to tell where it was coming from. It could have been the wind or a stray branch. I ignored it and focused on the warmth of the fire. As the night went on, the tapping grew louder and more persistent. It sounded like someone was knocking or tapping out a pattern. I checked outside the tent but saw nothing. I went back inside, but the sound was still there, now joined by a strange scraping noise. I tried to ignore it, but sleep was impossible. The noises kept getting louder and more aggressive. The tent seemed to be shaking a little, though there was no wind. I finally unzipped the flap to check outside. The night was still and silent, and the fire was dying down. I walked around the edge of the campsite, looking for anything that might explain the noises. As I neared the edge of the clearing, I spotted something odd. A shallow hole partly covered with leaves and dirt. I could see a corner of a wooden box sticking out. My heart raced as I dug up the box. It was old, and the wood was damp. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside were personal items, photos, letters, and a diary. The stuff looked like it had been buried for a long time. There was also a map with a marked point, pointing to a spot nearby. A cold shiver ran down my spine when I saw that the diary had entries about the campsite and the area around it. The last entry was from around the time of our last visit. It talked about someone watching from the woods and the need to leave before it was too late. Fear gripped me. I quickly packed up, deciding it was best to get out of there before anything else happened. As I drove away from the campsite, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The woods were dark and silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. Something that had been waiting for me to dig up the box. I never went back to that campsite, and I never told anyone about what I found. The sense of dread stayed with me, a constant reminder that some places hold dark secrets. To this day, I wonder if the things watching from the woods are still there, waiting for the next person to uncover what should have stayed buried. I decided to go camping at a spot my neighbor had mentioned. It wasn't a place many people knew about, which made it seem like the perfect escape. A quiet weekend away from the city noise sounded just right. I left early in the morning, driving through narrow, twisting roads that were lined with thick trees. As I got closer, the trees seemed to grow taller and denser, making the road darker. The road turned into a bumpy dirt path, and soon I reached the campsite, a small, open area surrounded by woods. The only sound was a distant stream, barely breaking the silence. I set up my tent and started a small fire. The day passed quietly, with nothing but the sounds of birds and rustling leaves around me. As the sun set, the temperature dropped and the woods grew even darker. The light from the fire only lit up a small area around me, leaving everything else in deep shadow. That's when I noticed something strange. The woods, which had been full of noises from animals and rustling leaves, suddenly went quiet. It wasn't a normal kind of quiet. Everything just stopped all at once. I felt a cold chill go through me, but I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. I tried to sleep, but I kept waking up to small sounds, like something moving outside the tent. The noises were quiet, like something light stepping on leaves. I kept telling myself it was just animals, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but with every noise, the uneasy feeling grew stronger. In the early morning hours, I heard something I couldn't ignore. It was the sound of footsteps, slow, careful, and definitely human, moving around my campsite. They were trying to be quiet as if they didn't want to be heard. My heart started racing as I lay there, holding my breath, listening to the slow steps. I realized I wasn't alone anymore. The footsteps circled my tent, stopping every few seconds. I stayed as still as possible, barely breathing, hoping that whoever it was would just leave. But they didn't. Instead, they stopped right next to my tent, so close that I could hear them breathing. I waited, not knowing what to do. Every second felt like it stretched on forever. Then, without warning, the footsteps started moving away, slowly at first, then faster, until they faded into the distance. I didn't sleep at all for the rest of the night, too scared to move or make a sound. As soon as the first light of dawn appeared, I packed up my things as fast as I could. I didn't even stop to eat. I just wanted to get out of there. I left the campsite and made my way back to the car, feeling like something was watching me the entire time. The woods, which had seemed so peaceful the day before, now felt like they were hiding something dangerous. When I finally reached my car, I felt a rush of relief. I threw my gear in the back, got in, and started the engine. I didn't look back as I drove away, the feeling of being watched slowly fading as I put more distance between myself and that place. But later, when I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me. It wasn't just in the woods. Whatever it was, it followed me back. I checked the locks on my doors, double-checking each one, but the uneasy feeling never left. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft creak outside my window, like someone stepping on a loose board. I froze, barely breathing as the sound moved closer. The same slow, careful footsteps I'd heard in the woods. It wasn't the woods that weren't as empty as they seemed. Sometimes what follows you home doesn't just stay outside. It's already inside, waiting for the right moment to let you know you were never alone. And this time, there's nowhere to run. I had always wanted to go camping in the French countryside. There was something about the untouched woods, the quiet little towns, and the vast open fields that felt so peaceful. After working nonstop for months, I decided to take a week off and finally do it. I picked a spot deep in the woods, not far from a small village where there weren't many people around. It seemed like the perfect place to relax. The first 2 days were calm. The trees stood tall and still, with just the sound of leaves moving every now and then. At night, it was cool but not freezing, and the stars above stretched across the sky. I had everything I needed, set up my tent and made simple meals over the fire. There wasn't anyone around for miles, and I liked that. It felt like I had the whole forest to myself. But on the third night, things started to feel different. As the sun went down, I realized the usual calm was gone. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no wind, nothing. It felt like the forest was waiting for something. I tried to ignore it, but it left me feeling uneasy, like something wasn't right. I made dinner like I usually did and got into my tent once the fire went out. I wanted to sleep, but that feeling of something being wrong wouldn't go away. I lay in the dark, listening to the silence, hoping it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep from being so tired. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. The tent was completely dark, and at first I didn't know why I was awake. Then I heard it. A sound I couldn't ignore. Footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps coming from just outside my tent. My heart was pounding, and I stayed as still as I could, barely breathing. I didn't want to believe what I was hearing, but it was real. The footsteps got closer, circling around my tent. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, but the way the steps sounded, they were too slow, too heavy, too much like a person. I grabbed my flashlight, trying not to make any noise, and turned it on. The light flashed through the tent, and for a second, the steps stopped and everything went quiet again. But my mind was racing. What if someone was out there? What were they doing? I listened, hoping it would go away, but after a few moments, the steps started again, this time moving away, back into the forest. I stayed awake the rest of the night, my heart racing every time I thought I heard something, but the footsteps didn't come back. When the sun finally started to rise, I cautiously stepped out of my tent. There were no signs that anyone had been there, no tracks, no broken branches, nothing out of place. But that feeling that someone had been watching me stuck around. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, deciding I'd had enough of the French woods. On the drive back to the village, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Someone or something had been out there, walking around my camp. I kept trying to make sense of it, but the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I felt. It didn't seem like something I could just brush off. A few days later, when I was back home, I did some digging online to see if I could find out more about the area. That's when I came across some old stories about people disappearing in that forest, hikers and campers who went into the woods and never came back. No one ever found their bodies, and the local police had stopped looking after a while. That was all I needed to know. I'll never go back to that place. Not even close. It felt like the forest was hiding something dark that I was lucky to escape from. I still wonder what was out there that night, circling my tent, but part of me thinks it was just a warning. Next time, I might not be so lucky.